Hi, I'm Pastor Hale, and I want to welcome you to another edition of Today's Life brought to you by New Horizons Community Church here in Skowhegan. Grab your Bible. We're going to look one last time at the life of David, and we will see you after the service. God bless. Do you remember when there used to be soap operas on TV? Do they still have soap operas on TV? Yeah, I had an aunt that used to watch those, my Aunt Marjorie, and boy, they were awful. They were awful. And she I don't know, I think it was like a One Life to Live or something like that. She'd watch, and it was usually like poor acting, and just you could tell it was low budget stuff. But I was listening to the radio this week, and this is all for free. I was listening to the radio this week, and a guy was commenting how because of this pandemic we've had and the political scene and the world stage right now, and it looks like China may even invade Taiwan is it? We're looking at, and there's just a lot of stuff. He said that it doesn't matter who you are, what you do for a living. Everyone feels like they're at the end of their rope. There's a lot of end of rope feeling. Even in the church, there's a lot of end of rope feeling. People are feeling like they're in a soap opera. That's why I wanted to bring it full circle around like that, in a soap opera. But today I want to share with you a soap opera that took place thousands of years ago. All right? So I've got characters to introduce. I've got sadness. I've got drama. I've got murders. All the things that make for a really good and bad soap opera. All right? So we're wrapping up this series. It was a 5-part series. And, before we go any further, I want to welcome those that are watching online. That's great. Great to have you here with us. And our church online and our church here. Today we're going to be reminded of something that is actually very few of us needed to be reminded of. But I'm going to remind you anyway. And then we're going to place this very, very common phenomenon, this thing that we've all experienced within a brand new context. And for some of you, you're going to be like, this is going to be a reminder. And what today reminds us of is simply this, and it's in your notes, is that life rarely goes as planned. And everybody said amen. It's true, isn't it? Life rarely goes as planned. I mean, plans are good. Everyone should have a plan. I mean, I'm married to a planner. I mean, and that's good that I'm married to a planner because I'm not a great planner. But everybody needs a plan. And the reality is that reality is greater than our plans, doesn't it? Is that reality always trumps our plans. No pun intended. It does. It always trumps our plans. Reality, let's put it this way. We can plan, we can try, we can fit, but reality always wins. Right? If things don't always turn out as planned, sometimes because of things other people do, and sometimes it's things don't turn out as planned because of things that we do. And at the end of the day, what it means is that some of our dreams won't come true. Or worse than that, some of our dreams can't come true. Ouch. Reality check, beginning of our soap opera. It may be that the two of you may not live happily ever after. That you may not get the opportunity to ever walk your daughter down the aisle. It means that perhaps you never have to purchase or need to purchase a high chair. Those are plans. Perhaps the second marriage is starting to feel a little bit like the first marriage, huh? That prodigal son or that prodigal daughter looks like he or she may not be coming home. You're not going to get into the school of your dreams. And he's going to marry her anyway? And she's going to marry him anyway? And it looks like the money's always going to be tight. And it looks like the dream job isn't going to be the dream job after all. And the thing is, depending on what kind of church you grew up or what kind of religious background you've had or any if at all, it is that when we've seen our dreams begin to crumble and things aren't going in the direction that we really think they should go, that we thought they would, there's this internal sense of panic, and then there's this internal sense of anger, right? Because after all, God promised, didn't He? And you kind of feel like that, kind of like God promised and God owes you, right? Because you know why? Because you played by the rules. You did everything right. You raised them right. You behaved. You waited for certain things. Isn't there some kind of cause and effect, or as the Bible would say, isn't there some kind of reaping and sowing and reaping? I mean, you did everything you knew to do the things right, and you played the game right, and you lived the right way, and yet your dreams aren't coming true, and in some cases it looks like they can't come true. In fact, do you know what it looks like? It looks like everybody else's dreams are coming true but yours. Huh? And it looks like God has granted somebody else your stinking wish. And so today, as we wrap up this series of David, it's going to go long, so it'll be all right. Settle in. You guys at home, get some water to drink. We're going to be with you for a while. So we're going to ask the question that David's life answers for us. What should we do, or what do we do when our dreams can't come true? Now, we saw a few weeks ago when David was in his 20s, and thanks to the behavior of the decisions of crazy King Saul, I don't know if anyone had that on a bumper sticker on a chariot, but they should have, because he was nuts. David realizes that some of his dreams weren't going to come true. He had a plan. It was all planned out. And God had made David very, very specific promises, but crazy King Saul decided that David needed to die. And consequently, David finds himself on the run in the wilderness. Everything is upside down. And he did what many of us do when we realize our dreams aren't coming true. Do you know what he did? He panicked. He panicked. And when he panicked, he made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. And people died. But during that season of his life, he learned a very important lesson. Now, as king, he would undermine his own dreams coming true. And the lesson that he learned in that particular season of his life is a lesson for all of us. About 22 years after David became king. So last week we left off with David being king. He was about 22 years, and now we're skipping ahead 22 years, and David is actually more like in his 50s now. Can any of you really young people relate to being in your 50s? Because that's me. I'm 59. One left. Yeah, one left. He's no longer, you understand this about David, he's no longer the cool kid who killed Goliath. Now he's in his 50s, and while in this age, 50s is a pretty good age to be in our world, in ancient times, 50s was old. You probably lost most of your teeth, you were not young, you were not handsome, and you probably smelled bad. He never brushed his teeth. He didn't have anyone anymore. They didn't bathe. I'm painting a pretty good picture. He's not cool King David. He's now King David in his 50s. Again, he's been king for about 22 years, so he's not even new and fresh in the king business. And he sends his men off to war, and we don't know why he didn't go to this particular war. Maybe because he was how old at that point, you know. So he gets up one night, in the middle of the night, and it's a famous story, and he looks out and he sees Uriah, one of his friends, one of his companions, actually one of his generals or commanders in his army. He sees Uriah's wife. She's bathing, and her name is Bathsheba. I always think it's cool that she's taken a bath and her first name is Bath. Maybe, I don't know, Bathsheba. And so he calls his servant and he goes, "Who's that? Who's that?" And the servant says, that is Uriah the Hittite's wife. And David says, "Send her to me." Now, as we know from the beginning of this series, God had warned Israel, and he did. Don't have a king. Let me be your king. All right? Because when you have a king, there are problems that come from having a king. And one of the problems of having a king is no one can tell the king no. You can't do it. You can tell a priest no, you can tell a prophet no, you can tell a judge no, but you can't tell the king no. You can't even say So Bathsheba comes up to David, and everyone knows this story pretty much. They spend the night together. Probably they spend multiple nights together, and she sends a message to him. I think you know what that means. She says, "I'm pregnant." And David decides, hey, I can fix this. So he calls for her husband, Uriah, to come off the battlefield. Have him give me a report. Yeah. Hey, what's going on? And as long as you're here, Uriah, off the battlefield, back in your hometown, why don't you go home? See what he's doing? Huh? But Uriah is a righteous man. So he spends the night on the grounds outside the palace gate. Well, David finds out. He goes out to get the morning paper off the step, and there's Uriah taking a nap. I made that up. But he said, why didn't you go home to your wife? He said, how can I spend the night with my wife when my men are dying and being slaughtered in the mud? So David says, okay, let's spend one more night. So David gets him drunk, and David points him toward his home, and he says, now go home. That's a good boy. Go home. So the next morning, David gets up, and Uriah still hasn't gone home. Because Uriah isn't going to spend the night in luxury when his men are dying on the battlefield. He's just not going to do it. He's a good man. So David writes a message to Joab. That's Uriah's. Oh, I got to bring all kinds of names in this soap opera, so please stay with me. He sends a message to Joab. That's Uriah's boss, Uriah's commander. And he says, Dear Joab, put Uriah in the fiercest part of the battle, and when things get really hot, just draw back from him and his bodyguard. You know what it was? It was a death warrant. It was a death sentence. So he signs it, seals it, gives it to Uriah, who gives it to Joab. And Joab does as the king asked. Why? Because you don't tell the king no. You don't say no to. So Uriah, he dies in battle. Bathsheba mourns. David brings her in. She's pregnant. And it looks like David the magnanimous, the wonderful man, is going to raise someone else's child. So he marries Bathsheba, and everything's cool. Everything's good. And David has managed the outcome. Except, this was no secret. Huh? In a world where there are slaves everywhere, the walls eventually can hear, and the walls eventually talk. And so, after they're married, the prophet Nathan, another name, he comes and he makes an appointment with David. And he comes in to David and he tells him this fictitious story. It's a great story. Read it. It's great. And David gets really, really, really mad at the guy in the story. And Nathan the prophet, he goes, hey, by the way, David, you're the guy in the story. And you can just sense the blood leaving David's face, and he turns pale. And David breaks. He allows the law of God to break him. But here's the problem, and I hope you'll get this. Every sin, everyone say every sin. Every sin, whether you're a Christian or not, all right, or a religious person or not, every sin comes with a pre-packaged consequence. Every sin comes pre-packaged with a penalty. And that day, as David began to mourn his sin and own his sin, because that's important, Nathan said this to him. He says, this is what the Lord says. Nathan says, out of your household, out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. What you did in secret, although you did this in secret, I'm going to do this thing, and I'm going to bring about this calamity in broad daylight before all of Israel, because you're the leader. You are accountable to the entire kingdom, and because you're a king and you're accountable to the entire kingdom, I'm going to bring about a consequence that everybody in the kingdom knows about. Then David said to Nathan, and this is so powerful, don't miss this. This is the king. Remember, he could do no wrong. You couldn't say no. This is David. I have sinned against the Lord. And what this is a reminder that even though David was a king, even though he was flawed, and he never confused himself with the king of Israel. He didn't do it. He never abandoned God's law. He broke it, don't misunderstand me. But then he would allow God's law to break him. Excuse me. And once again, we find him acknowledging his fault and surrendering to the will of God. He said, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but there is going to be an unavoidable consequence for what you did. You had someone who was innocent murdered, and you tried to hide it, and you tried to lie to the entire nation. A year goes by, and nothing happens. 2 years go by, nothing happens. 5 years go by, 10 years. Finally, 10 years go by. And this consequence, it takes hold of David, and it turns David's world upside down. And at the end of the story, his dreams can't come true. In your notes, David's oldest son was a guy named Amnon. You'll find it right there in 2 Samuel 13. It was Amnon. And because he was the oldest son, he was in line to become the next king of Israel, right? But Amnon was consumed with lust for his, this is where it gets really soap opera-y, all right? He's really consumed with lust for his half-sister named Tamar. So Tamar and Amnon, they share one parent, but they don't share two. So Amnon just cannot get her out of his head. He cannot get her off of his mind. And apparently she doesn't even know he exists. She just completely ignores him. So finally, after he's done everything he can to get the attention of his sister, to get her, he's just so consumed with lust, he pretends that he's very, very, very ill. And all of a sudden, all the brothers and sisters know there's something wrong with Amnon. He's very ill. And so he sends a message to David. And he says, David, King David, is it okay if my sister Tamar prepares a special meal for me? Would that be all right? David says, that's fine. So she brings the meal over. And Amnon sends everybody out of the house, and it's just the two of them. Wouldn't that be a warning sign? Shouldn't it be? It is in today's world. And he tries to talk her into going to bed with him. And she begs, and she begs, and she begs. And then he acknowledges, I'm not really sick. He was just trying to get her attention. And she resists. And she says, absolutely no, my brother. Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done. We're related. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. We don't do this wicked thing. But the text says he refused to listen. And since he was stronger, he raped her. And in this next verse, this is just gut-wrenching. I can't remember I remember the first time I read it, and I could not believe what I was reading. But again, the biographers, the people who bring us this story, they don't skip any of the details. The text says this, then Amnon hated her with an intense hatred after he raped her. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. And Amnon said, get up and get out. Well, she was devastated. She knows that her life is ruined forever. Because, see, understand, she, in this culture, she will never marry. And there's no secrets in the palace. In fact, there's no secrets to the degree that King David won't find out. And when he finds out, when David finds out that his oldest son did this to one of his daughters, he's furious. But do you know what David did? Nothing. He did nothing. Now, we're only left to guess why David didn't do anything. But throughout the season of his life, as a parent, he just does nothing. But David had lost all of his moral authority. I mean, who is David, after all, to tell anybody how to manage their lives, their private lives after what he had done? Because everyone knew what he did. So David does nothing. And now we're introduced to, I'm introducing more characters. David introduces another one of his sons, and his name is Absalom. Absalom is David's third son. We think that his second son has passed away by this time. So he's the next one to be in line to be the king. If Amnon is in fact not the king. Absalom is Tamar's brother by the same two parents. So Absalom takes Tamar into his home. She's just destitute. And he takes her into his home, and he does nothing. He does nothing. He never speaks to Amnon. I mean, he doesn't speak to him positively. He doesn't speak about him negatively. He acts as if it never existed. Okay? And a year goes by, nothing. 2 years go by, nothing. And Absalom, he's so shrewd, right? And he thinks that everyone has forgotten what happens. And what happens is he throws a big party, a big feast at his home. And he invites the entire family, that is. And he even invites David. But David says, I can't come. if I come, it would just be such a burden to your home. And Absalom says, well, what if I invite all my brothers? And David says, knock yourself out. Look it up. That's what he says. All right? Y'all have a good time. That was southern Israel. All right? So Absalom still has this big feast. Everybody gets good and drunk. And when Amnon is really, really drunk and all the brothers and the families are gathered at these tables, he sends in his men into the dining hall and they slaughter Amnon in front of all the brothers. I think that's kind of a killjoy at the party. Just, it's not the same as a piñata, right? And the brothers get up and they flee to Jerusalem. And Absalom gets up and he flees north to what we would call today Syria. All right? Now, when King David finds out that his oldest son has been murdered by his, what we find out later, his favorite son, you know what King David does? He does nothing. He does nothing. And life just goes on. 3 long years pass. And David, he's missing Absalom. 3 long years. Things have settled down. Perhaps people have forgotten. Life, again, gets back to normal. So David invites Absalom back to Jerusalem, back to the capital. And when Absalom gets there, he's told, you're invited to move back to your home, but the king refuses to see you. You got it? I want you to know your surroundings, but no king. And so Absalom, for the next 2 years, tries to get in to see King David. And King David ignores him. He ignores him. And Absalom he's getting furious. He's getting ticked off. You brought me here, and it's like I'm under house arrest. My family won't speak to me. Nobody will send a message to my father. And he got angrier and angrier. And finally, he's just fed up. So he sends his servant to Joab's farm. Now, Joab is the commander of all of David's army. And what he was is he was kind of the go-between. I hope I'm keeping you guys with me. It's a long story, but it's great. So he's kind of like the go-between to get messages out to the king. If you wanted to get to the king, you had to go to Joab, right? But Joab won't have anything to do with Absalom either. And so Absalom sends his servants to Joab's farm, and he burns down his entire farm. And so Joab comes over to the house. Finally, he says, hey, what are you up to? And Absalom says, well, it's finally nice to see you, Joab. I've been trying to get a message to you and to my father for 2 years, and you've ignored me. So now that I have your undivided attention once I've burned your place to the ground, would you please tell my father I want to see him? Joab agrees. Okay, I'll work it out. Well, Joab's smart. He knows you just don't approach the king like David directly like this. So he sends in a woman. This woman makes up this incredible story, and David gets all engaged in the story emotionally. And then basically at the end of the story, the person that David is most frustrated with at the end of the story, this thing, well, it's just like Nathan, because she's like, well, my king, it's you again. You're all upset with yourself. And he said, did Joab send you? And she's like, she says, yes, Joab sent me. So he calls for Joab, and Joab says, King, your highness, please see your son Absalom. He's waited for 2 years. So Absalom comes in before the king, and he bows down, and David lays his hands on Absalom. It's kind of his way of saying you're forgiven and our relationship is restored, but it's not. Absalom is hurt. And David never calls. I mean, the best we can tell, David never calls for his son again. Well, he's angry and he's so hurt. And he decides he's going to overthrow his father and to take the kingdom and to take the throne for himself. See how it's like a soap opera? It's cool. Perhaps he thought, it's mine anyway. It's mine eventually, so I'm going to take it now. So what he does, and he's so wise, every morning, early in the morning, Absalom, he would grab a chair and he'd grab a table, and basically he'd set up court outside the gates of the main city. And anyone that wanted to come in and try and talk to David to get justice or for some cause, Absalom would say, hey, let me help you. So he just kind of set himself up to be a judge, and he would stay there day after day after day. Do you know what he was doing? And he would see all these court cases. And the people would have to wait for weeks and weeks, perhaps for months, to see the king. And over time, the text tells us that Absalom stole the hearts of the people. For 4 years, he sat outside the gates of the city, and he would talk to anyone. hear any of their cases. People recognized how smart he was, how wise he was, what a great leader he was. And over time, Absalom stole the hearts of the people. And then 4 years later, he sets in motion his plot to overthrow his father. Then Absalom tells us that he sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, you say, Absalom is king in Hebron. So he sent all these messengers out, and he had all these people scattered out all over the primary cities. And he said, on a certain time, at a certain day, you're all going to run through the city and just announce Absalom is king, Absalom is king, Absalom. Now, why? There are no newspapers. There's no radio. There's no quick communication. So people basically believed whatever they heard. Maybe Absalom is king because David died. We haven't heard anything. We don't hear anything. There's no communication. Maybe Absalom is king because David just abdicated and decided to let Absalom be king. We don't know. But he already had the hearts of the people. So when the people heard that Absalom had become king, they rejoiced all over the kingdom, even though it hadn't actually happened. So 16 years now. 16 years after David's incident with Bathsheba. 16 years. And David's world is upside down. His firstborn has been murdered by his favorite son, who has now instigated a civil war. And it's about to divide the entire nation. A messenger came to David. He says, the hearts of the people are with Absalom. And when David heard this, apparently he wasn't completely surprised. No doubt he'd heard about it. You know, the rumors that get passed around for a couple of years. And the text says this. David said to all his officials, everyone who was with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee the city, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly and overtake us and bring ruin on us, and he will put the entire city to the sword. See, David knew if they stayed and they tried to defend the city, if Absalom takes the city, then he will assume everyone in the city kind of sided with me, and then he'll put everyone to the sword in the city. So it's a bad deal. So David abandons his throne to save the city, and once again, he's a fugitive. For he finds himself running from the place that he considered his home. Running from the people who supposedly loved him. Once again, he's a fugitive. But this time, he's not 22. This time, he's 61. This was not the dream. This was not supposed to happen. This was not the way he was supposed to spend this season of his life. It's not what he expected. His dreams were not coming true, and as it turned out, they could not come true. And there we are. There we are. Here is where, once again, our lives, at some point in the past or now or in the future, they intersect with this great soap opera of David. Why? Well, when we are heartbroken or disappointed, maybe angry, frustrated with God, maybe looking for someone to blame, maybe you've decided to blame God. After all, where is God? Could he have kept this from happening, right? What's the point of going on? What's the point of even trying? Why even try? You hung in there with him year after year after year. You've hung in there year after year, and look what she's done. Look what he's done. And you've waited and you waited and you wait for what? You raised him right. You raised her right. And you don't deserve to be treated like this, like the way he's treating you. Look at the way she's treating you. And if you were honest, you were told to do things right, and good things would happen. Well, I was honest, and I lost the job. You worked hard, but that hasn't really worked out. And this is where, oftentimes, we make things worse for ourselves. Isn't it? Isn't it? This is because we're so angry, and we're so hurt, and we're so frustrated with God, and we're so disappointed with God, we hurt ourselves, which creates more regret, which creates more debt, which creates more pain relievers. And yet there's more pain. But this isn't the first time David had faced a situation like this. David remembered, because the first time he fled the kingdom, he took matters into his own hands. But he learned something along the way, and I want you to catch this. This is the lesson from the life of David today. And this is the lesson from this season of the life of David that we all kind of need to take heart. So here's what happened. The whole caravan, all of his family and all of his family, anybody who's a supporter of David, they're now filing out of the city, trying to get out of Jerusalem before Absalom and his men and his followers get there. The whole countryside wept out loud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, which I've seen, and all the people moved toward the wilderness. The wilderness. There's nothing out there. So David isn't even sure where they're going at this point. He just knows, hey, we got to get out of Dodge. All right? And anybody who supports me, they got to get out of the city. Introduction of another character. Zadok. Zadok, who was the high priest, he was there too, leaving the city with David. The Levites, he was with the tribe that takes care of the sacrificial system. And they were there carrying the Ark of the Covenant. All right? Now, this is really important. Stick with me. All right. When you read these stories, you can quickly go by and miss the significance of this. The Ark of the Covenant of God represented the presence of God for ancient Israel. You could not be closer to God as far as ancient Israel was concerned as when you were in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, for some people, was almost considered a good luck charm. And if you took the Ark of the Covenant into battle, you were sure to win. It represented the presence of God. So when David saw them bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the people who were in the city, it looked as if the presence of God was leaving the city along with David. Bad deal for those sticking around. But the implications were a bit overwhelming for David. In fact, David decided, this feels manipulative. And listen to what he said. The king said to Zadok, take the Ark of God back into the city. Now, the people who were around David, who heard him say this command, this decision, I guarantee you they moaned. Because one of the things that gave them courage was that they were following the king. And one of the things that they also gave them courage was that they were following the presence of God Almighty. And for David to command them to take the presence of God, the blessings of God, the Ark of the Covenant, back into the city, it was almost as if David was saying, Absalom is in the right and we're in the wrong. But listen to David's explanation as to why he told Zadok the priest to take the Ark of the Covenant back to the city. And this is powerful. He said, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, in other words, I'm not going to try and manipulate God. I'm not going to try and talk God into something He doesn't want to do. I'm not going to play games. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, He will bring me back and let me see it, the ark, in His dwelling place, the ark. Again, if God chooses to bring me back, God chooses to bring me back, but I'm not taking matters into my own hands. But if He says, David said to Zadok, but if God says, I'm not pleased with you, then David says, then I'm ready. And here's the punctuation. Let Him, talking about God, let Him do to me whatever seems good to Him. Not my will, thy will. Are you with me? Okay. So every time I do my will, I mess up. I mess things up. Every time I do things my way, I get in the way. Not my will, thy will. This is the lesson that is so powerful. David lost his world, but he did not lose his confidence in God. David's entire world is upside down, but he does not lose his faith in God. He doesn't reject God's law. He doesn't consider himself above the law. David understands he's flawed. He's a flawed man. He's not a perfect man. But he refuses to be the king. David never loses sight of the fact that he's simply a king, small letter A. He did not lose his confidence in his faith in God. He chose not to abandon God when it appeared that God had abandoned him. Did you get that? I'm not going to war with my son. I'm not going to risk the city because it's not about me. God put me in place, and God will choose how and when and where I'm replaced. Wow. And he leaves the city and he leaves the ark. And Absalom shows up in the city and he takes the city without even a fight. But it's a hollow victory because he has the capital, but he doesn't have the king. And the only way for him to proclaim himself king, the non-disputed king, is to have his father and to actually put his father to death. So, he's in the capital, he's kind of setting up shop in the palace and in the throne room, and he's trying, as he's doing all this setting up, he's trying to decide what to do. And in walks another character in the story, and his name is Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel is probably Bathsheba's grandfather, and Ahithophel was one of David's trusted advisors. But when Ahithophel changes sides, when he realizes that Absalom's going to be the next king, potentially, the whole nation is basically following Absalom. So he stays in the palace, David leaves, and when Absalom shows up, Ahithophel is there, and he's welcome there, and he says, hey, I'm here to be your advisor, just as I was to your father all those years. And I'm here to do whatever I can to help you. And Absalom says to Ahithophel, what should I do? What should I do next? And Ahithophel gave Absalom this advice. He says, do not rest here. You need to get the men that you have and pursue your father immediately. Don't let him get organized. Don't let him gather more people around him. He's tired. They're not ready. They haven't set up any kind of defense. So, if you go now, you can catch him. And if you catch him, you can kill him. And once he's gone, all of those people who left the city with him, they'll follow you back. And you'll be the king of all Israel. But there was another counselor, all right? And he was there as well, and his name was Hushai. Now, Hushai had actually left the city with David. He's gone, all right? And David realized that Ahithophel was still in the city. So he says to Hushai, he says, I want you to go back to the city, and I want you to greet Absalom, and I want you to pretend to be a good advisor for him as well. But I want you to try and frustrate any plans of Ahithophel, because Ahithophel will give him good advice. But I need you to give him bad advice. So he went back to the palace. And when Absalom meets Hushai, as they were coming into the palace, he said, you've heard Ahithophel's advice to me. What do you recommend? And here's what Hushai said. He replied to Absalom, the advice that Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. It was bad advice. Let me tell you what you ought to do, Absalom. Think about it. You know your father and his men. They are fighters. He may be 61, but don't be fooled by his age. He's still a fighter. And he is as fierce as wild bears robbed of their cubs. Now, for some of us, that might just be a figure of speech. But these men had hunted bears. And they knew what it was like to have a mama bear when separated from her cubs. It's not a pretty thing. And Hushai is saying, your dad is like a mama bear who's been robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He's not going to spend the night with his troops. It's not like you're just going to catch up with him and find him. Even now, he's probably in a cave or he's hiding some other place. In other words, don't rush. Don't listen to Ahithophel. Take your time, consolidate, gather a larger army, wait. And once you gather all the tribes to yourself, then you can personally, by yourself, you can lead this campaign to overthrow your father. And Absalom thought, that's great advice. And Ahithophel knew that the end was near. He knew that if David is given time to gather his army, he would be defeated. He's trying to give all this stuff in open combat. So you know what Ahithophel did? Because the king didn't care for his advice. Ahithophel went home and he hung himself. Isn't that an amazing story? Because it's like in the Bible. Gosh, you should read it. It's great stuff. David, in the meantime, goes to a city you probably never heard of. It's called Mahanaim. And he goes to the city of Mahanaim, and he hears that Absalom is coming. And he realizes that he has no choice but to defend himself and the people who are with him. He's got to defend them. So David does a very, very smart thing. David divides his army into thirds. And he puts a different commander, head guy, over each third. And he gives them these very explicit instructions, and he gives them the commander's instructions so that all the troops can hear. And here's what he said. When you catch up with Absalom's army, and when you catch up with Absalom, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. I realize this is war. It's going to be chaotic, but if there's any way to spare my son's life, I want you to spare his life. And all the troops heard the king giving these orders concerning Absalom and to all the commanders. So everybody knew. If you find Absalom, you take Absalom alive and you bring him to David. So David's generals insist that David not join them in battle. So he stays on the wall of the city and he watches the soldiers march out to confront his son in battle. Now the text tells us that this battle did not take place in an open plain. A lot of them did, but this one didn't. It actually took place in the forest of Ephraim. The forest of Ephraim, which meant superior numbers meant very little. Experience and organization and communication mattered much more. And fortunately, David was wise enough. Now, we don't know if David drew his men into the forest. We don't know why the battle was in the forest, but David's men were better organized to fight under those conditions because he had the three commanders, whereas Absalom's troop were all looking to him for leadership. So the text says, and I'm starting to wind this down, guys. I know it's long, but it's a great story. There, Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great. 20,000 men. And the battle spread out over the entire countryside, and this is one of my favorite lines in the Old Testament. And the forest swallowed up more that day than the sword. Now, as soon as I read this, I think of Treebeard in The Lord of the Rings. That's just me. All right? And the forest swallowed them up. You know. I don't think that's what happened. What I think was happened was where David's men were experienced, there was low-hanging branches. There were a lot of roots, soft spots, and bogs that tripped up the horses. Anyway, many, many men were injured and taken out of the battle because of the fact that they were fighting in a forest. So eventually, Absalom is caught. And instead of being held prisoner and taken back to David, Joab butchers his son as the army watches. And once Absalom is taken out of action, once the people knew he was dead, his army immediately stopped fighting. They threw down their weapons, and the text says they just went home. And David is told about Absalom and that he's dead, and he mourns the loss of his son. In fact, he mourns the loss of his son to such a degree that the soldiers are afraid to celebrate their victory. So Joab goes to David and he says, "What's wrong with you? The way you're mourning your son, it's like the men think they've lost. The men feel as if you wish that they had died and your son had lived. Now get over this and go out there and celebrate that victory. They just gave you back the kingdom." But it was a hollow victory for David because he loved his son. Absalom, he's gone. How do you celebrate anything? So David, now he returns to Jerusalem as the king, but his world would never, ever be the same. And 9 years later, he died at the age of 70. Now it really speaks to the authenticity of this account, that the biographers seem to have nothing to hide from all of us of David's faults and his failures and his flaws. And the thing that's so amazing, the thing that I want us to take away as we wrap up this narrative of David, with all of his flaws, he never lost his confidence in God. He was a broken mess, but he still believed in God Almighty. Amen? Do you know anyone like that? When things did not go his way, and it was somebody else's fault? Or when things did not go his way and it was his own fault? With all of that, he never lost his confidence in God. That David's somewhat sad ending, and it is a sad ending, his somewhat sad ending reminds us of something extraordinarily important. If you've been daydreaming or thinking about something else, I really need you to come back and listen with me just for this part. Because this is the takeaway, simply this. This is important. Are you with me? The foundation of our faith, the foundation of your faith, the foundation of your faith, my faith, the foundation of our faith is not answered prayer. The foundation of our faith is not everything going our way. The foundation of our faith is not happily ever after endings. In fact, it's always a mistake. Even though we tend to do this, it's always a mistake to wrap your faith in God. Let me finish, please, before you get crazy on me. It's always a mistake to wrap your faith in God around the fulfillment of our dreams, around our prayers. It's always a mistake to wrap your confidence in God around the fulfillment of our dreams. My dreams came true. God is good. My dreams didn't come true. I don't think there's a God. It's always a mistake to wrap your faith and to wrap our confidence in God around dreams coming true or even answers to prayer. Because dreams that don't come true and prayers that don't get answered say nothing about the presence or the goodness or the faithfulness of our God. I've said a lot of words to say those 8 words. They say nothing about the presence, about His lack of activity. David, I think, of all people in the Old Testament, would be the quickest to remind us that when we feel forsaken, we're mistaken. That we're mistaken when we feel forsaken. That when circumstances don't go my way, when our dreams don't come true, to assume from circumstances that God is not... David would say no. Don't you dare make that mistake. Because through all the highs and the lows and the ups and the downs, David would say, God is with me. And we would do well with our own circumstances and with our own broken hearts and with our own anger and with our own dreams that can't or won't come true to join David in this extraordinary statement that he makes when he's leaving the city. All hope is gone. He doesn't even know if he'll ever see the city again. He doesn't even know if he'll ever be restored. He doesn't even know what's going to happen in this next season of life. To join him when he makes this incredible statement. If I don't know the future, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, He will bring me back. Let Him do to me whatever seems good to Him. In other words, not my will, Thy will. Not my will, Thy will. Not my will. Oh, I know how I want things to turn out. I know how I want things to go. I do. I know how I've prayed that they would go, and I thought for sure that they would go this way, but not my will. Thy will be done. I may lose my world, but I will not lose my confidence or my faith in God. It's not going to happen. I choose not to abandon Him even when it appears. Would you please highlight, circle, whatever you want to do with the word appears. Even when it appears that He's abandoned me. In fact, David wrote it. He journaled it. He takes all of this way back to the first part of our series, and we looked at this incredible statement, the declaration. And maybe it was these words of this very statement that got David through over and over and over throughout his life when he penned these powerful words. And some of you will remember it. That regardless of how things are going, when my dreams are not coming true, when they're not coming true, when they can't come true, in you and you, Lord, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. Amen? Okay. I'll tell you what's amazing. Been here a long time. I wish I had more time to talk about it. Okay? And the thing is that all of our friends watching on TV or online, depending on where you are, where you're seated, even here, do you know that people here, they look good. They're all dressed up, and because we get dressed up when we get together, some of us, and we all have a nice smile, and most of you smell good, right? All right? And I just had someone check their underarm. Stop that. And you're surrounded by people, don't miss me, that if they were to come up on this stage and they were to tell their story, this is their story. It's a story of heartbreak. It's a story of disappointment. It's a story of broken promises. It's a story of dreams that can't come true. Right, seniors? That's your story. That's my story. And yet, look around. Look around at these beautiful people. I mean it. Look around. You can look. It won't hurt. Oh, my goodness. You're surrounded by men and women who have extraordinary faith and confidence in God because they have not made the mistake of wrapping their faith in God around how God should respond or how God should behave. And you think, well, Brian, what's the point of even believing in God? What? Because there is a God, and He loves you. And that's why, in spite of what happens around us, we can say with confidence, not my will, thy will be done. Amen? All right. Last story, and I'm done. This is for free. I was preaching in Kansas one time, and we had a guy that was a pastor. He said he was a pastor from another denomination. I don't remember what it was. Years and years. And he's no longer doing it. And I preached a sermon. And, the people file out. And good message, pastor. Fair message, pastor. You missed your exit, pastor. Or whatever it is. Well, this pastor walked up to me and he said, why don't you preach about having the faith of the mustard seed and God will do what you ask Him? Because I want to know why my wife died. And he just kept on walking. And he did exactly what I'm trying to warn you people not to do. Husbands, if you don't go first, your wife will die. Wives, if you don't kill your husbands, something like that. Do you understand? Your dreams necessarily are not coming true. But there is one thing. My God is with me through it all. That is where I place my hope. In Him all day long. He is my rock. He's my shelter. He is the cleft that I run to. He's my stronghold. Look up what that is. Because I got troubles and I run to Him in my troubles. Okay. All right. Will you be a people that don't think you're forsaken? Because that's a mistake. Life can be a soap opera. And it can. Some of you are going through them right now. And they're awful, aren't they? But no, you're not going through it alone. That's the thing. And I know that when at the end of my life I break that tape at this journey, I'm heaven bound. So what's this tired old earth got to do with me? Right? Or you? Okay. That's what I wanted to share. God bless you. Don't leave unless you put your name on that piece of paper. We'll see you next week. Everyone watching online, God bless. Well, that brings us to a close of this 5-week series on the life of David. I hope you've grown and I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been challenged by it. So, hey, if you're ever in the Skowhegan, Maine area, we would love to have you be part of our church family. We're at 31 East Madison Road in Skowhegan, Maine. Our telephone number is 207-474-2957. Our website is nhccskowhegan.org. Well, until next time, God bless you. Have a great, great day.